When German tank divisions first encountered the British Matilda tank on the streets of the French city of Arras in the summer of 1940, genuine panic erupted at General Rommel's headquarters. The standard 37mm anti-tank guns, the very door knocker, as German soldiers themselves nicknamed it, bounced off the frontal armor of this vehicle like peas off a wall. The counterattack was only halted by field anti-aircraft guns, hastily deployed against ground targets. This was the Matilda, the British infantry tank that the Germans, following that encounter, dubbed with a term literally meaning "Queen of the Battlefield." But everything that happened next with this machine turns its story into one of the harshest examples of how technological superiority in one area can turn into a complete catastrophe in another. Friends, due to a shortage of archival footage, some scenes in this video have been recreated using artificial intelligence. Enjoy the viewing. To understand where this machine even came from, we need to go back 10 years, to Britain in the early 1930s, a country that at the time was almost completely devoid of its own school of tank design in the modern sense. Not because the British lacked engineers, because after the First World War, the War Office sincerely believed that the next major war would be fought much like the previous one: trenches, barbed wire, and a slow grinding through the front lines. It was this picture of a future war that shaped British tank doctrine, and not one, but two doctrines, which developed in parallel for years, hardly speaking to each other. One school, led by theorists like Percy Hobart, promoted the concept of cruiser tanks, fast, maneuverable machines for deep raids into enemy rear areas, modeled on cavalry. The second school was responsible for a completely different task, breaking through prepared defenses alongside infantry, step by step, under fire from anti-tank artillery. And here appears a designer named Carden, John Valentine Carden, head of the Vickers-Armstrongs firm, a man whose name few know today, although his engineering philosophy defined the appearance of British armored vehicles for years to come. Carden received technical specifications that sounded almost like a mockery: to create a tank capable of moving shoulder to shoulder with advancing infantry at a speed of no more than 8 miles per hour, that is about 13 kilometers per hour, the speed of a fast human walk, yet carrying armor capable of withstanding a direct hit from any existing anti-tank gun. Slow, but impenetrable. That was the formula Carden was given as a starting point. It's worth understanding the context in which this formula was born. The British Army of the early 1930s operated under conditions of the most severe austerity. Tank programs were regularly cut by Parliament to ridiculous budgets. Design bureaus worked for years on minimal funding, and the experience of the First World War suggested one simple image to military theorists: infantry bogged down at barbed wire under machine gun fire, needing a machine that would simply go through that meat grinder, ignoring small arms and light field artillery fire. No one in the War Office at that time included in the specifications a scenario where the enemy would mass deploy specialized anti-tank artillery with a caliber above 37 millimeters. The British Army simply had no such experience at the time. And here begins what is almost never spoken about directly in popular videos about the Matilda, because it spoils the beautiful picture of the invincible tank. The first prototype, designated A-11, was designed so rigidly within the budgetary constraints of the pre-war treasury that it turned into a technical mockery of itself. A single-ton turret with one machine gun. Crew, 2 men. Engine, a civilian one from a Ford bus. Speed, indeed about 8 miles per hour as required. But the firepower of this machine was practically zero. The machine earned the nickname Matilda precisely for its clumsy, squat, almost caricatured silhouette. According to legend, one of the factory engineers compared it to the Disney duck from the cartoons of that time, and the nickname stuck so firmly that it entered official documentation. I have long ceased to be surprised by reports on pre-war British tank programs, but the technical specifications of the A-11 still astonish me every time. The War Office officially approved a machine that didn't even have a proper cooling system radiator. The engine from a civilian truck simply wasn't designed for the loads of an 11-ton combat vehicle and regularly overheated during intensive maneuvering. This machine could survive enemy armor-piercing fire, its own engine overheating. Not always. By the start of the war in 1939, the British Army had managed to receive only a few dozen of these A-11 machines, and it almost immediately became clear that serious warfare with them was impossible. The machine gun armament made the tank useless against any more or less organized defense. The command urgently launched production of a modernized version, the A-12, the very machine that would enter history as the Matilda II. By the way, friends, after watching, don't forget to rate the video with a like, or a dislike if you disagree with something. The Matilda II received a full-fledged turret with a 2-pounder gun of about 40mm caliber and a machine gun. The crew was increased to 4 men, and most importantly, the armor was brought to levels that, as of 1939, looked simply absurd to any other design bureau in Europe. But here's a detail that is usually overlooked. Behind this decision lay another harsh compromise story. The gun, the 2-pounder, was chosen not because it was considered the best option for the future, but because it already existed, was already in production, and didn't require time to be developed from scratch. The War Office was in a hurry, understanding that the time until a major European war was measured in months, not years. More powerful guns were considered, but their development meant a delay in production of at least a year, and a year in 1938 was an unaffordable luxury. The decision to take what was already in stockpiles instead of waiting for the perfect gun ultimately became one of the main reasons why the Matilda II was already considered weakly armed by 1941, despite its phenomenal armor. The frontal armor of the hull reached 78 millimeters. For comparison, the German Panzer III of the same period had frontal armor of about 30 millimeters. That is, the Matilda II was protected by armor approximately 2.5 times thicker than that of the main German medium tank. This gap was so vast that at the distances of May 1940, during the fighting in France, German anti-tank artillery, the standard 37mm guns, proved nearly powerless against the Matilda II at any normal combat ranges. And this is precisely the episode near Arras with which I began. The British Matilda tank's counterattack on German positions near Arras in May 1940 caught the German command so completely by surprise that Rommel, in his personal notes later analyzed by German armor historians Thomas Jentz and Hilary Doyle, described this episode as a moment when his entire division was on the verge of panic. According to German frontline reports from that period, artillery crews reported instances where 37mm shells literally shattered on the armor of the British vehicles without penetrating, and the crews continued moving as if there was no fire at all. For German soldiers accustomed to the relatively light Polish and French tanks, this was something beyond comprehension. The counterattack near Arras was ultimately stopped only by 88mm anti-aircraft guns deployed against ground targets, a decision Rommel himself would later call a key lesson of the entire campaign. It was this episode that largely spurred the German command to accelerate the development of more powerful anti-tank measures for the years ahead. But if this tank was so invulnerable, why is it hardly remembered today in the same way as the T-34 or the Tiger? Why did the machine that literally frightened Rommel not become the cornerstone of British armored might for the entire war? The answer lies in the same formula with which it all began: slow but impenetrable. The designers received a technical specification for a slow, heavily armored infantry support tank, and they executed it perfectly. However, the idea of supporting infantry at walking pace was calculated for a positional war, for slowly grinding through fortified lines on the model of 1917. But the real war that began in 1939 turned out to be a war of maneuver, a war of armored wedges, deep breakthroughs, and rapid encirclements. The Matilda II's maximum speed was about 15 miles per hour on roads, that is, just over 24 kilometers per hour, and that in theory. In practice, according to British Army field reports, its speed over cross-country terrain dropped to levels comparable to a tractor's speed today. The engine, or more precisely, two paired diesel engines from London buses, placed side by side due to a shortage of a proper tank engine, delivered a combined power output utterly insufficient for a vehicle of such mass. And here is the moment that most videos about this machine prefer to gloss over as quickly as possible, because it severely tarnishes the image of the invulnerable queen of the battlefield. In North Africa, during the battles of 1941 to 1942, the Matilda II encountered the German 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank gun, and later, the 88mm anti-aircraft guns redeployed for direct fire against tanks. These guns could penetrate the Matilda II's frontal armor at ranges where the Matilda II itself, due to its low speed and weak gun, simply could not manage to either close in or retreat. The low speed, which on paper was compensated for by thick armor, became a death sentence in real desert combat. German artillerymen, having determined the effective firing range against the Matilda II, would simply take up positions and wait for the British column to slowly approach within killing distance. The cumbersome machine physically could not escape such fire, it was too slow. Operation Crusader in November 1941 became one of the starkest examples of this paradox. The attacking British forces included a significant number of Matilda IIs, considered the main heavy infantry support tank at the time. According to archival data cited in the works of British armor historian George Forty, losses of these vehicles to German anti-tank artillery in certain episodes of the operation reached levels that turned the myth of the invulnerable Matilda into a bitter joke among British tank crews by the beginning of 1942. In popular materials about the African campaign, the emphasis is usually on the duels between Tigers and Shermans, which happened much later, or on episodes involving Crusaders and Stuarts, fast cruiser tanks. The fate of the Matilda II in North Africa is hardly remembered, and it's clear why. This narrative thread spoils the overall picture of triumphant British armored superiority over the German by the war's end. And the truth is that it was here, in the sands of Libya and Egypt, that the myth of the invulnerable queen of the battlefield was finally and harshly dispelled, long before truly powerful German tanks even took the stage. By that time, the British Army had begun receiving American tanks via the Lend-Lease program, primarily the Grant and the Sherman, which, despite having weaker armor compared to the Matilda II, possessed a key advantage: speed, allowing them to maneuver under fire, exit the kill zone of anti-tank guns, and quickly change position. And this, in my opinion, is the key point of the entire story. By 1942, the British command in practice arrived at the same conclusion that Soviet designers had built into the T-34 back in 1940. Mobility on a battlefield saturated with anti-tank weapons is more important than static armor thickness. Only they arrived at this conclusion not on the drawing board, but through the losses of real crews in the sands of Libya. The Matilda II began to withdraw from the front lines precisely at the moment when the war finally transformed from positional to maneuver warfare. That is, precisely when the philosophy embedded in this machine's foundation from the very beginning ceased to correspond to reality. However, writing off the Matilda II as a complete failure would also be unfair, and here it is worth calling things by their proper names. On fronts where maneuver was limited by the very nature of the terrain, this machine continued to operate and deliver results until the very end of the war. In Southeast Asia, against Japanese forces whose anti-tank artillery was frankly weak, the Matilda II's thick armor once again became the decisive factor, this time in its favor. This is part 2 of 3. Japanese low-caliber anti-tank guns simply could not penetrate the frontal armor of this vehicle at most combat ranges, and its low speed in jungle conditions, where moving quickly was physically impossible for anyone, ceased to be a disadvantage. Australian tank units actively used the Matilda II in battles in New Guinea and other islands of the Pacific theatre of war right up until 1945, meaning the vehicle, which had already been written off in North Africa by 1942, continued to fight for another 3 years, simply under entirely different conditions for which it was originally better suited than for the desert. In jungle conditions, the low speed transformed from a drawback into near invisibility in loss statistics. The tank simply could not physically find itself in the kind of open maneuver warfare situation where it had been so vulnerable in Africa. The dense vegetation, narrow paths, and the Japanese army's lack of mass modern anti-tank artillery, all of this aligned precisely with the conditions for which the 1936 concept had originally been designed. Essentially, Australian crews in the jungles of New Guinea fought on roughly the same principles that Carden had based his calculations on a decade earlier, slowly crawling forward under the protection of thick armor, ignoring small arms fire. And herein lies the main inconvenient conclusion of this story, one that few people speak about directly. The Matilda II was not a bad tank. It was a tank designed for one specific kind of war, a slow, positional European war of attrition, but thrown into a completely different war, a mobile and fast-paced one, for which its basic concept was simply unsuitable. The designers executed the technical specifications flawlessly. The problem was not with the engineers or the machine itself. The problem was that the specifications were written for the last war, but they had to fight in the next one.
This, by the way, is the very lesson that would later be repeated with Soviet heavy tanks of the post-war generation, and with American vehicles at the beginning of the Korean War, and many more times in 20th century military history. Equipment perfectly designed for the conditions of the previous conflict regularly proves deadly for its own crews in the conditions of the next one. The documents from this period have long been declassified and are available in the archival holdings of Britain's National Archives. And if you compare the production plans of 1936 with the actual combat reports of 1941, the discrepancy between expectations and reality is visible to the naked eye. Today, surviving examples of the Matilda II stand in tank museums around the world, including in Russia, in Kubinka, where several such vehicles arrived under the Lend-Lease program during the war and were meticulously studied by Soviet engineers for their design solutions. Visitors walk past these squat, ungainly, almost caricatured-looking machines, unaware that this very ugly duckling once forced Rommel to frantically redeploy anti-aircraft batteries against a ground target, and just a year and a half later became a target for those same guns, simply converted to a different caliber. The story of the Matilda II is a story about how the most logical engineering solution can turn out to be absolutely wrong if the war it was made for had already ended by the time the vehicle rolled off the assembly line. How many more pieces of equipment in history have been created perfectly for a war that would never come? Among those watching, there are surely people who have personally encountered this machine in museums or know its technical details better than any documentary. If I missed an important detail or made a mistake somewhere, correct me in the comments. I read everything. And rate this episode. Like or dislike, the choice is yours. This is part 3 of 3.